Well, good morning, Redemption. So many of you are like seated and ready to go this morning, which I'm happy. We're here, ready to learn. Would you pray with me? We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll just start us with a prayer this morning. God, you are so good to us. We rest in your presence again this morning. Thank you for gathering your people today here and around the world, around our city. God, we think of our brothers and sisters gathering in various places, and we just say thank you. Thank you that we get to be your people. Thank you that your Spirit speaks to us and dwells with us and in us. So we trust that this morning. We come expectant and ready to meet with you. Thanks for today. Amen. So it is our Exploration Sunday, and we always come to Exploration Sunday with a lot of excitement. We have guest teachers that come to be with us, and we're starting a new month with a new focus. And so it's always a time of excitement. And before we kind of jump into the excitement of the day and the teaching that we have, I do just want to take a minute to acknowledge that since we were last together, and because of the rhythm of our church family, it's been 3 Sundays since we were together. And a lot has happened in the world since then. And we've had at least 5 mass shootings since we last gathered. And I just want to acknowledge that what we've been carrying as a people and as a nation, and again, the call to lament that's created in us. We sent out over the week some reflections and some opportunities to step into action and advocacy. And I just want to call your attention to that. If you don't receive our emails, you can fill out a Connect card over at that table and turn it in just so that you can have those. If you didn't have a chance to read them or see them, I just encourage you to go back and look those over as we continue to be a people that wrestle with what does it mean to be peacemakers in this world as those who are following Jesus. And so I just wanted to just acknowledge that we live in this world, in this culture, and are carrying different things as we engage in that. And as we've been talking as a staff team about what does it mean to engage in the world as the people of God, and specifically as Redemption, we're just reminded again of our rhythm of a family, that we are the family of God. We wrestle with these things together. We learn from each other and the different ways that we think about things and the different perspectives that we bring. And we are in formation. We go to the scriptures and we wrestle with the scriptures of what is this call of Christ to be a people of peace in this world, and what does that look like, and how does that how is that embodied in the world? And so we gather here on Sundays to wrestle with that. We gather in our community groups to wrestle with that. We gather along the way as we're going about our life. And then that plays out in the health of our communities as each of us are committed to seeing the thriving and flourishing of the communities where God has placed us, of the places that we have chosen to engage. And so I just want to encourage us as we're thinking about what do I do, to engage in this rhythm of being a family in formation for the health of our communities. We're starting a new month off focusing on what it means to look at who Christ is, the Son of Man, in the book of Mark. And I'm excited to continue our journey in the Gospels together. And we have a couple things coming up that I just want to share with you before we jump into the teaching this morning. So we have a formation method training coming up on June 17th here in this room. From 10 to 3, it's a Friday. And if you haven't gone through that training, I really encourage you to do it. It's the formation method is how we do our community groups, how we facilitate our groups, how we have a space of celebration and accountability and tracking with each other. So if you want a refresher or you just haven't had a chance to go through the training yet, I invite you into that. Also, I just want to point out that Fieldwork offers that to our Redemption Church community for free, and it usually is a $250 course. So I just want to encourage you to take advantage of that as well. Again, you can fill out a Connect card, just write your name and that you're interested in the formation method training. And then a couple in our church and their daughter, Natalie, they are committed to the health of foster kids and youth and abused kids in Orange County, and they participate every year in Royal Family Kids Camp, the Molstad's family. And Royal Family Kids Camp, their big week that they put on is coming up in June. And on June 22nd, the Wednesday of that week, they're looking for people who can go just for the afternoon and volunteer at the birthday party. So because these kids move around from house to house and often don't have a birthday party, while they're at camp, they put on one giant birthday party for everyone. And so I'm going to go up that day and volunteer in the afternoon. If anyone else is interested in finding out more about the ministry or wants to serve in that way, I invite you to go with me. Again, write your name on a Connect card and just write birthday party or Royal Family Kids and put it in the basket, and I'll follow up with you so we could go serve together with that ministry and support the Molstads in this ministry that they've been participating in for a long time. So it's Exploration Sunday, and we come to worship on Exploration Sunday really engaging our minds. This is a space where we study and we have extended time of teaching, and we also worship with our giving. If you're looking to worship with song and music, I invite you to come back the next 2 Sundays when we'll do that. But today, I invite you to engage your mind and also your giving. We give as a way of releasing control and just saying, God, we trust you. We trust that there's more. We trust that with you there's always enough. And so we give to support the work of our church as we're formed for the health of our communities. So you can do that at the box in the back or online at redemptionchurch.org. So that's like kind of our long intro. We have some teaching for you this morning. I am going to read a poem to get us started in our artist space. We had 2 teachers lined up for you, and I'm sorry to say that Jerry Camery-Hoggatt is not able to join us unexpectedly this morning. And so we are going to hear from Dr. Gombis and have an extended time with him and extended time for your questions and answers. So just remember that on Exploration Sunday, we do questions and responses. And so be thinking as you're listening to the teaching of what questions come up for you that you want to explore together, and you'll have a chance to ask those later in the talk. But we also, in this space, like to, in our worship, celebrate the creative and just be reminded of all the different ways that God speaks to us and that we can respond to God's Spirit. So I bring to you an invitation from Mary Oliver this morning. Would you listen with me? Oh, do you have time to linger for just a little while out of your busy and very important day for the goldfinches that have gathered in a field of thistles for a musical battle, to see who can sing the highest note or the lowest, or the most expressive of mirth or the most tender? Their strong, blunt beaks drink the air as they strive melodiously, not for your sake and not for mine, and not for the sake of winning, but for sheer delight and gratitude. Believe us, they say. It is a serious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world. I beg of you, do not walk by without pausing to attend to this rather ridiculous performance. It could mean something. It could mean everything. It could be what Rilke meant when he wrote, "You must change your life." So I offer that as an invitation as we pause this morning and make time to hear how God may speak to us. Dr. Tim Gombis is with us again from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was a professor of New Testament at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. He hosts a podcast, Faith Improvised, which I've been learning a ton from and highly recommend. And he has been with us before and just been a delightful presence of good humor and kindness. And we're just grateful to have you back again. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Gombis?
Hey, just tell me when it's like 25 minutes or so. So good morning. Very happy to be back with you again today. And I was asked to talk about the Gospel of Mark, which I'm very happy to do. And I was looking forward to doing plenty of learning about the Gospel of Mark this morning from Jerry, but that's all right. That responsibility will fall to all of you as we have discussion. Christine said questions and responses, which sounds a whole lot better to me than questions and answers. So I can tell you what I think, but I have no guarantee that matches reality. So I want to talk about a few things having to do with the Gospel of Mark. And first of all, just want to note that each of the four Gospels makes a unique contribution to our understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus' mission is all about. It's important that we keep those two things together, who Jesus is and what Jesus' mission was all about. And I had said that the last time that I was here, and I mostly say that to remind myself about the importance of that reality. Because for many of us as Christian people, Jesus is central. Obviously, he's central to this whole thing. But for most of us, the way that we have been taught to imagine what it means to be Christian, it's that, I am Christian, and Jesus is a big deal because he's a big deal to me. Jesus is in my heart. But the four Gospels portray Jesus as reigning as king over a whole realm that he is inviting people to inhabit. So the scene is a little bit different. It's not Jesus sort of living in individual hearts. It's Jesus reigning over a kingdom and inviting people to join that kingdom. So the conception of things is a little bit different. So anyway, I try to always be changing my language to reflect that reality. Instead of talking about myself as a Christian, I keep trying to remind myself that I'm Christian. I'm Christian. I'm a body part. Any language that I can use for myself to remind myself that I'm part of a bigger reality, and it's not all about me and Jesus, is I find very, very helpful. But the four Gospels each give a unique angle on who Jesus is and what his mission is all about. And Mark obviously makes his own unique contribution, but I guess what I want to highlight for you is how it is that Mark makes a highly unsettling contribution. Matthew and Luke and John write great Gospels. They're so good, and I highly commend them to you. The history of the church reflects kind of like this view of things. So in scholarship, and if you read like the great preachers of the church, most of them do work on Matthew, have sermons on Matthew, they have sermons on Luke, and they have sermons on John. And then Mark is like the really, the neglected gospel. I don't want to use a metaphor. I don't want to offend anybody. It's passed over. Even Augustine, who was a great 4th century church figure, said Mark is this like pathetic imitator of Matthew. And it is really pathetic in a sense. If you're not attuned to what Mark is doing, and what Mark is doing is he's sort of assuming that most of the churches that he's familiar with around the Mediterranean have heard a gospel. It's not that they have read a gospel. The Gospels weren't written yet when Mark sat down to write his gospel. But what happened was authorized church figures were visiting churches and basically orally performing a gospel, the story of Jesus, so that people who were wanting to be disciples of Jesus could understand what this whole thing was all about. And those gospel performances took on a certain form. And if you're familiar with any kind of way that literature works, Matthew, Luke, and John, and those other gospels took on a very similar form. A bunch of confused disciples hear Jesus is preaching, and Jesus arrives, as the expected Son of God, and all these disciples are called, and they move from confusion to clarity, and then they are sent out on mission to the world, and Jesus is, he's warmly received, but then those religious officials persecute him, and they put him to death, and he is raised again from the dead, and he ascends and rules as Lord, and the disciples are on their way to make disciples of the rest of the world. Mark knows that form, and he knows that churches are familiar with that form, and he is well aware that there are plenty of churches that have grown complacent in carrying out what Jesus has said to do, which is to offer hospitality to societies marginalized and forgotten, And Mark writes a gospel to basically say to comfortable churches, you have no idea what this whole thing is about. And he completely turns the gospel story on its head, which is really shocking. And it's sort of a surprise he gets to do that, actually. But this is what Mark is up to. In chapter 1, things are awesome. It starts the best. The disciples drop everything and follow Jesus. And crowds can't get enough of Jesus, and he's casting out demons, and everybody is wowed. And then things begin to kind of come apart in chapters 2 and 3. And then as things go on, they just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And the disciples become confused by what Jesus is talking about. And by the end of the gospel, Jesus is put to death, and the disciples flee. It's like, wait a minute. Isn't there supposed to be a happy ending to this thing? Aren't things supposed to turn around in some way? And the final scene of Mark's gospel is the women who have arrived to Jesus' tomb to anoint his body. And there's a young man at the tomb, and he says to the women, Jesus isn't here, he's been raised from the dead. And go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going to meet them in Galilee. And the women, because they're afraid, do not do so. The end. That is how it ends. And I do wish Jerry was here, because he would have been able to narrate the impact that that ending is supposed to have. It's supposed to leave audiences with just discomfort. It's supposed to generate, remember, it's not supposed to be read by individuals. 94% of the Mediterranean world was illiterate. The gospel would have been heard by audiences, and it's supposed to unsettle audiences. It's supposed to start arguments. That's not how it ends. There's a different ending. And then I believe that detail that Mark just drops in at the end, I think that he's the only one that does that, where the young man says he's going to meet you again in Galilee. I think that that's supposed to sort of sit in people's minds, because the gospel begins in Galilee and then goes down to Jerusalem at the end. So what if this whole thing were to start over? How would it go differently? What if the disciples were to make a new journey with Jesus and track all their mistakes and missteps along the way? Which episodes are critical, and what decisions might go differently? And if they did, how might the story play out? So I think that that's what Mark is up to in this story, because the story itself, Mark, is very, very unsettling. It's like if you have... There's one way to make sure that nobody talks about a novel or a film, and that's to provide us a really satisfying ending. And there's one way to make sure that everybody is agitated and talks about a story or a film or a novel, and that's to provide an awkward ending. Like if you've ever seen No Country for Old Men, the way that film and novel ends, well, I read the novel because I didn't understand how the ending. And that's a good story. It makes you kind of go back. And there are some times where a conclusion of a film is not for you, or it raises questions like Lost in Translation, where there's a conclusion to the relationship at the end, but you don't know what it is, which in a sense sort of puts the question with the viewer. You also have to ask that question. How is it going to end for you? You don't know. Anyway, Mark knows what he's doing. He's no fool. And I say that because there are some senses in which Mark, as a narrator, has been criticized because his gospel is just so awkward. Mark's an awkward writer. Well, or is he a genius? I'll show you one of the ways that works out. One of the ways that this works out, where Mark says things in a way that's a bit unsettling, and he knows what he's doing. And that's how Mark portrays Jesus as the Son of God. And let's see where I put this at the very bottom of the first page. I didn't number these pages, and that was an accident. At the very bottom, I say that Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is God because he's portrayed as having authority over creation. Really quickly, one of the things that Mark has Jesus doing is Mark is showing us that Jesus is God. He's not telling us. Okay, some gospel writers tell but don't show. Mark shows but doesn't tell. So what I mean by that is Mark picks up some roles that only God plays in the Old Testament, and he has Jesus play those roles. And then other characters in the story say things like, who is this? Only God can, and so audiences are supposed to raise that question. At the beginning of chapter 4, chapters 4 through 8 are a discrete part of Mark where Jesus and the disciples keep crisscrossing the Sea of Galilee. And they do that in chapters 4 through 8, but they don't do it after, and they don't do it before, just in that section, which is just kind of interesting. And that's not just a minor detail. First century audiences would know what Mark is doing by doing that, especially when Jesus and the disciples go out on the Sea of Galilee when it's stormy, because that's not something that you would do in the first century world. First century world, you would not want to have a house by the water, because the water is not any place you would go into for recreation. You do not swim for recreation, because water and the sea and rivers are representative of the ancient forces of chaos that pull apart God's world. So it's not like you'd want to go into those, and there are deep sea monsters that you just don't want to have contact with. So when Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee, that's not like these are sort of leisure cruises or a minor detail. Jesus is doing something very specific, and especially when he calms the storms. What Mark is doing is he's portraying Jesus as God who has authority over creation and who is not afraid of the forces of chaos because he's the king over the forces of chaos. And Mark tips this off, which is really fascinating, and I talk about this on the top of the second page. Most of our English translations tidy Mark up, which is really frustrating because Mark is not. Mark is like is a writer, like Johnny Rotten is a writer. Okay, he means to sort of write in a way that just punches polite people in the throat. He's not. He means to offend. But one of the ways that he does this, he indicates this, is he says that in 4:1, Jesus was teaching by the sea, and it was so crowded that he got into a boat to sit on the sea, which English translations tidy that up, because that doesn't sound right. He gets into a boat, and he sits in the boat on the sea, right? That makes better sense. Like the NIV kind of tidies that up. Because who, after all, sits on the sea? Doesn't make any sense. Unless you are an ancient audience and you know who sits on the sea. Because Yahweh is portrayed as being enthroned above the waters in many, many psalms. And in many psalms, if you ever read those psalms like very devotionally, and you read about the voice of God thunders over the waters, the voice of God breaks the cedars of Lebanon, and you're like, I don't get anything out of that. Like, my heart's not warmed at all. No devotional buzz this morning. Those psalms are very, very directly pointed in the ancient world, because they're ways of the God of Israel being portrayed as sovereign over the forces of chaos. So when Jesus is sitting on the sea, he is the king over the forces that threaten to undo God's world. That's what Mark is doing. So in chapters 4 through 8, when you see Jesus crisscrossing the Sea of Galilee constantly, just realize that Mark is like shouting, these are billboards blinking in the ancient world. Jesus is king over creation, king over the forces of chaos. And there are a couple other ways that Mark portrays Jesus as the Son of God. Of course, he forgives sins, as I already mentioned, and he receives worship. Only God receives worship in the Old Testament, and there are a number of characters in Mark who, when they hear about Jesus or they see Jesus, they run to him and they fall down before him. And whenever that happens to some other kind of like biblical character, like an angel, the angel will say, stand up, don't you dare bow down to me. But Jesus receives that worship, which again, Mark isn't saying Jesus is God. He's portraying scenes in which Jesus is God. Because Mark, if he wants to do anything, he wants to make audiences do the work. He's not doing your work for you. You've got to lean in and do the work of discernment. Jesus is portrayed also as the Son of Man in Mark's gospel, and this is one of the biggest depictions, one of the titles that's most prominent. And I want to highlight this, the second point that I make here, and that is that the Son of Man theme picks up on a tradition in Daniel where the Son of Man is portrayed as suffering in the present age, but is going to receive glory in the future age. Suffering in the present age, but is going to receive glory in the future age. And this is probably the biggest thing that Jesus' disciples fight him on in the Gospel of Mark. When he tells his disciples that he's going to Jerusalem, he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be beaten and spit on, rejected, and then he's going to be put to death. And his disciples pretty repeatedly either tried to talk him out of that, or to just reject that he even said it, or try to divert his attention, or do whatever, because they don't want that to happen. Who would want that to be their destiny? That's not anything for us to look forward to. And I say that because I feel like I always want to recognize that that the disciples have a pretty, like 180-degree view of being Christian than Jesus is laying out for them. They simply don't want what he wants for them. They want the opposite. They want prestige, they want significance, they want influence, they want impact, they want success, all of that. And I'm saying that because those are all realities that that I, as a well-trained American white male in this American moment, all of those things are deeply embedded within me. Those are desires I was taught to cultivate. And so when I think about where I am in Mark's gospel, I am right there next to Peter and John and James, asking Jesus for the most prominent places in the kingdom of God. I'm there fighting with my fellow disciples over who's the most prominent and who deserves the most glory. And I want Jesus to go anywhere but a cross, because that means I'm going to have to join him in suffering. So Mark is a challenge to us. It is a real challenge. But that whole notion of suffering now and glory later, when Jesus comes in his glory, is what humanity is all about. Jesus as the Son of Man is trying to emphasize that. Also, this Son of Man notion emphasizes how Jesus is a prophet in the Gospel of Mark. And prophets are not the kind of people that you wanted to be around if your life was comfortable in Old Testament Israel. And if you read Mark carefully, you'll notice how it is that Jesus is not very nice in Mark's gospel. He's not kind. He's not patient. He often has extreme reactions to things that happen that raise questions. And he's very much like a prophet in the Old Testament who just sort of made situations awkward and uncomfortable. In fact, in Mark, when people have to talk about who Jesus is, they'll often say things like, maybe that's Elijah come back from the dead, or maybe it's one of the prophets. So people kept mistaking Jesus for one of these figures because that's how he was behaving. Anyway, I just say that again because people that occupy my social location were uncomfortable when Jesus was around, which again reminds me how much work I have to do to sort of consider myself someone who can credibly claim to be a follower of Jesus. It's a challenge. Okay. Jesus is also the authoritative teacher in the Gospel of Mark, along the lines of what I've been talking about. Mark, I believe, is written to churches that have not paid close enough attention to what Jesus has told them. And one of the reasons I say that is because Jesus is often called a teacher in Mark's Gospel, but there's almost no teaching of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. He's often doing things, or there's just not teaching stretches in Mark. So Mark kind of assumes you all know what he has said. The problem is you're not doing it. And one of those examples is here in Mark 1, where Mark piles up words for teaching, and everybody responds to Jesus' teaching, but there's no teaching. It's an exorcism, which, again, Mark is not expecting his story to be consistent and make sense to people that are not paying close attention to what he's doing. So I think Mark is written for Christian audiences to help us understand we need to lean in a bit more closely and rethink what we think Jesus has been all about from the beginning. And the biggest thing that Mark wants audiences to understand is that Jesus is the cruciform king of the cross-shaped kingdom of God. That is, Jesus calls disciples to pick up their crosses and to follow him on his way to the cross. And if you look at the scene very carefully of when Jesus is lifted up on the cross and beaten by the Roman soldiers and acclaimed to be king, and then crowned, all those things that happen to him are sort of upside down and sort of carnivalesque versions of what happens when a new Caesar is appointed in Rome. So there's some, they mean to be mocking Jesus, but Mark is taking it very seriously, I think, because Jesus actually does ascend to his throne on the cross, because he's ruling as that kind of ruler over a kingdom of disciples on their crosses. And that's the mode of life that Jesus wants us to take on, which means our personal ambition and our quest for prestige and our desires for power and our love of possessions and all of that kind of stuff has to go on the cross so that we can experience genuine life, which is a challenge, again, like I've said, because if you have a lot of that stuff, you can come to love it and grow comfortable with it. So we know where our work lies. And finally, just the practice that Mark commends in all of us. One of the reasons I feel like Mark would be a dropout of gospel writing school is that he never has Jesus, and he never has this in his gospel, tell all of us to go out and preach the gospel. This is kind of wild, growing up as an evangelical kid who we were supposed to be missionaries every day and share the gospel as much as possible. And constantly, Jesus in Mark is saying, don't tell anybody about this. Jesus told them in no uncertain terms were they to tell anybody about this. Jesus warned them sternly. It's like, all right, we'll keep quiet about this. And the reason is because we don't know Jesus like we think we do. And because the reality of Jesus and of God and of the kingdom is far more mysterious than we can grapple with on like a first pass. Unless we really lean in and discern closely, we'll miss it. We'll miss it. The disciples missed it. Mark saw that some early churches have missed it, and our tendency is to do the same. And so our first priority is to do the hard work of listening to what Jesus has to say in the Gospel of Mark and learning to see. Verbs for hearing and verbs for seeing are really important in Mark's Gospel. And there's one character who kind of gets things right, and that's blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10, when Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" He had just asked James and John that question, and they said, "We want the most important places in the kingdom." And then when he asks Bartimaeus, what do you want me to do for you? He says, Rabbi, I want to see, which is what James and John should have been praying. So I would just invite you to consider praying that. Open our eyes, help us to see, help us to truly hear, help us to truly understand, and then do the hard work of perhaps remaining silent and doing the work of waiting for that illumination to come. So, let's talk about Mark. What are you wondering about? Did you just jump into it? Jeff, did you want to say anything?
Let's just jump into it.
All right, let's go.
I'm particularly interested in the ending there, because in Mark 6, I think it's 34, 35. It's the kind of that tie into the silence. It's the compelling people to be quiet. But throughout all of the gospel, he's in this seemingly frantic hurry to explain everything, and he's telling the story as if they went to this place and they herded this place. So I just maybe talk a little bit more about that juxtaposition. What's Mark trying to do? Being in a frantic hurry, but then also saying, but sit and wait and be in silence, because that seems like a paradox to me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's, so in Mark, there's constant action. In fact, if you read Mark through, I would recommend reading it through in the NASB, because that's a translation that keeps a lot of the details in. You get a real good sense of how awkward and hurried the narrative is. The NIV, I get what they're doing, but they try to clean it up a little bit. Anyway, but the pace is so fast. And in Mark, one of the interesting features is that the size of crowds keeps growing. It keeps growing. This is like a bigger crowd than last time, and then an even bigger. And it's like if you are an American, this is going so well. This is going so well. Just like if you were a Roman, this is awesome. Except you keep reading the details that Mark gives. An even bigger crowd was there so that Jesus could not. And then the biggest crowd was there so that Jesus could not. And it's like, wow, this is interesting. Big crowds are an obstacle. Big crowds actually indicate that something's gone wrong. Because it's very likely that if there's a large crowd drawn by gospel preaching, that they have not heard accurately that this is a message that is going to cost everything, and it's Jesus going on his way to the cross. So big crowds, what's interesting is that in the early chapters, they keep growing, and then later, when Judas comes, it's Judas and the high priest and a crowd, and then the crowds turn on Jesus at the end. So if you read it to the end, you see what crowds do, then go back to the beginning and reread it. The crowds you see are actually a negative character. So what Jesus wants is for people, also understand this, Israel back in the time was occupied territory. I mean, these are oppressed people, and there's revolutionary fervor breaking out. They want relief and release. And Jesus knows that if the word gets out too quickly, everyone's going to assume that this is just like, we're going to blast the Romans off the map. They'll get a wrong idea that this is actually a very different kind of a movement that he's building. So he wants to kind of tamp down the enthusiasm. So he's going around talking about it, but he wants the word to spread far more slowly. And it doesn't, and that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, that seems to turn on him at the end.
Yeah.
The other part of that silence, Jesus, and maybe even, I hadn't thought about this until you mentioned the crisscrossing the Sea of Galilee, but a lot of that is to get away from the crowds.
Yeah.
And then Jesus regularly gets away from the crowds, and it feels like that's where he rejuvenates, reconnects, gets in a position where he's able then to bring teaching and that countercultural, authority, healing to the world.
Yeah.
Talk about how Mark is trying to reflect that kind of in the story, and how he maybe, I mean, is that the same in the other Gospels where they show Jesus getting away in silence and solitude and reconnection? Is that where he's kind of gathering power? That's that paradoxical power.
Yeah, that might be. I haven't looked to see how other Gospels develop that. But yeah, that's happening in Mark, where the activity is like, it's so frantic that it's overtaking what Jesus wants to do. And part of what's essential for him is to get some alone time, to get some time for him to be in prayer. And not only do crowds prevent that, but the disciples do when they seek him out. Jesus tried to get alone, and the disciples seek him out. What's interesting is in Greek, later that verb is used where a crowd or soldiers seek him out to arrest him. So like the disciples kind of are on the same agenda where they're disturbing Jesus' time and mission.
Yeah. And they're bringing that same like noise and chaos of the world to him because they're expecting him to be a different sort of king.
Yep. They don't understand what his agenda is all about. Yeah. And they try to talk him out of it.
Right. Constantly trying to talk him out of it. Yeah, that's good. If you have questions, by the way, raise your hand. Christine has a microphone in the back, and we'll come to you. So if you have one, feel free.
Good morning, Tim. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Brenda.
So I really love this whole slowing of the gospel out to the world concept. But how does this play into this whole push that we have in not just America, but globally to reach the ends of the earth with the gospel? I mean, there's organizations, there's a coalition of like 1,600 mission-serving organizations around the world. So it's not just uniquely American that feel like we need to reach the gospel or get the gospel in the hands of every single living person to usher in the coming of God. How does this all play into what Mark's saying about this slowness or silence and this Great Commission? I just don't know how to sit with it anymore, ever since I've heard you say this before.
Yeah. I think Mark is inviting us to ask ourselves, have we understood it? Do we know what we're talking about? Has this whole thing actually created the kind of transformed community that God has sought to create? Or have we somehow managed to create something big and awesome and impressive and 100% American and like with just Jesus sprinkling on top? So to my mind, Mark wants us to slow way down and consider whether we have something quite wrong. Also, keep in mind that a lot of sociologists, let alone South American folks, Asian folks, African people, have done a lot of reflection over the last 50 years or so to ask the question, have we created little American things in the rest of the world and not very Christian things in the rest of the world? Have we exported Western realities and American realities, or have we exported Christian realities? So some of those answers are pretty arresting. So I think a lot of that is cause for reflection.
Really quick follow-up question. Do you feel like the urgency that we feel in getting the gospel out to usher in the kingdom of God, or usher in the second coming, so to speak, is American?
It's not Bible.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, far less urgency. Again. So I think here's where it's important that Jesus gets increasingly agitated as he tells people to would you shut up? You do not know what you're talking about. And there's a very interesting episode that happens. One of the disciples are sent out on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus sees a storm and he has whipped up. He comes down, and if you've ever read this and wondered what's going on, Jesus intends to pass them by. I never understood that until more recently, where it's not that Jesus is giving them the silent treatment. What he's trying to do, there's this whole tradition with Moses, with Elijah, and with Job, where God passes by biblical figures and to reveal himself. And so Jesus wants to reveal himself and who he is to to the disciples. And in the Job instance, where the Creator God is the great wave walker, which is what Jesus is doing, performing what it means to be God, Job talks about how God is so mysterious, even when he passes by, he is too wonderful for me to understand. And that expression just keeps ringing in my mind, that as a reminder that this whole reality is far better, richer, deeper, wider than many of us have been taught. And I think we're just in way too much of a hurry to get out there and save the world.
Yeah, and one of the big things that I was hearing you saying earlier is Mark assumes that everybody that's hearing this gospel knows the teaching of Jesus, but they're not actually doing it. They're not embodying it in the communities where they are, right? I mean, and so I think there's this element of, us even, pressing deeper into embodying the way of Jesus here and now. And the healthy byproduct of that, I assume, would be that the gospel would be proclaimed ever more increasingly in our community and then beyond our community, versus we've got to go and take our surface level gospel and import the cultural American aspects of it into these other communities as well. Right?
Totally. Oh, no, I'm good. Oh, should I?
No, I mean, we're just, we've got chairs.
Tim, could you speak to
I'll stand up.
the suffering now, glory later idea, and maybe ways that, ways that we can reframe our idea of what glory means, especially in light of maybe like Holy Spirit acts and like we want the victory now, and just be curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so in Mark, Jesus is calling disciples to pick up their cross and follow him, and Jesus himself is going to Jerusalem to die, to give his life. But he talks about how there's a future day of judgment coming when the Son of Man is going to come in glory with his angels and is going to judge then, and then at that point is going to save and redeem those who have suffered along with Jesus. So this is an age of suffering now, but of glory later when the fullness of the kingdom comes. And in Mark 9, where Jesus takes some of his disciples up on a mountain and he's revealed with his glory, some of his disciples are like, let's build shelters here. We want to stay in this moment. We don't want to have this era be an era of suffering. And Mark 13 is a very interesting chapter because Jesus talks about, here's how things are going to unfold the rest of the age. It's just going to be one big shitstorm, and, stuff is just going to unfold, wars and famines, and, it's just going to be bad. And what you need to do is be on the lookout for when things are just going to come apart in the city wherever you're living, because your community is vulnerable. You might have to just relocate, get out of town. This is going to be an age where it just hurts. So I find that to be a real challenge for me, because my life in many ways does not hurt. And so, studying Mark's gospel has been a real difficulty, reading it with a life that's really comfortable. So I imagine that for many communities that are suffering, like in my town or in this city, this kind of word, this kind of message is a real hope. But what about for people whose lives are comfortable? So for me, that means seeking to try to fit things into my life that where I'm having more and more solidarity with people whose lives are suffering, whatever that looks like, to sort of get in on that as much as possible. Does that make sense? And also, I am very, very, as Mark goes on, what glory looks like is when people do welcome the marginalized or serve the suffering. That's what glory looks like, because that's a window into somebody who's going to experience glory in the future. So all of the kind of hyper-promising, spectacular Christianity that I was raised in, to me I just see it as a total sham. It's like, this is what America would produce if America produced Christianity. And this is what capitalism would produce if capitalism produced Christianity. And I say that as like a 100% beneficiary of these systems. But I also, I want to have a clear idea of like what messages are coming my way. So, yeah, I think that my work lies in discerning what are all these false messages of hopefulness where there's not actual profound hope. Do you know what I mean? So by the way, I'll just be very autobiographical here. I was given a version of Christianity, do everything just right, and everything will work out for you, like family-wise, career-wise. You'll have success and fulfillment and yada, 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 which when you're 22, 23, that's what I wanted. And so like that's the course that we pursued. And that makes a lot of sense and is really awesome until tragedies start unfolding in your life. That you can't account how do we keep having this happen? How did we face these like debilitating losses? Because I was guaranteed something. So where are you, God? I wish I had read Mark sooner.
Could you define glory?
Yeah. So glory, in the New Testament, glory has everything to do with the future day of Christ, the future day of the Lord, when God returns in Jesus to set everything right, to fully renew creation, and to restore bodies the way that bodies are meant to be according to God's creation. So glory has everything to do with the return of creation to what it should have been like, the return of human bodies to what they should be like, the restoration of community to what all of that should be. That's going to happen in the future. That's glory. And the only way that we get that, which is everything that we want, is if we endure in this era, enduring suffering when we're called to suffer out of faithfulness to Jesus. The temptation is to grab for glory now in some fashion, whatever that means, like prestige or power, honor. But if we resist doing that, we'll get glory in the future.
Yeah, because it feels like they're competing glory definitions that we're in right now.
That's right. How culture defines glory. Yep. What does a perfect life look like, or what is whatever. We have to discern those messages and make sure that we're pursuing humility, care for community, and not being in competition with one another for prestige and all that kind of stuff.
John?
You've kind of been orbiting this, but at the risk of undermining what may be a potentially mystical message, you seem to be talking a lot about what Mark is not. And I was wondering if you could talk about what it is.
What do you mean?
You said Mark is basically sent to a people who have heard the gospel, and Mark is like, it is not this. You have no idea what you're talking about. Jesus does not behave that way. But what is it?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, great. So there's two things. Disciples, what disciples do in the Gospel of Mark is kind of like, non-concretely, they follow Jesus, they take up their cross, they are with Jesus. But those are sort of abstract ways of talking about like being faithful to, or metaphorical ways. The two concrete things that communities of disciples do in Mark is they serve the needy, and they as a community welcome into the community people that society has marginalized, or people that society says don't matter. So service and hospitality are what defines being Christian in Mark. Now that's a really big deal, because hospitality, everybody would be tempted to offer hospitality to people who socially matter, because that prestige rubs off on the rest of us. But this is where Jesus where disciples are trying to push out children, and Jesus says, he puts the child in the center, and then puts his arms around the child, and says, as often as you welcome one of these into your community, you're welcoming me. So that's what it means to be Christian as community life. Does that make sense? It's shocking to me. It was shocking to me also that it's so pared down. It's like, wait a minute, like I'm doing a ton of other stuff, going on mission trips and all that. Isn't that impressive? It's like, no, service to the needy, hospitality to the marginalized.
This take up your cross idea, is it coming? I wonder if there's something to unpack there. This take up your cross idea, is it coming from, is it a colloquialism that has existed in this culture already? Or is it these people having heard the gospel already, understanding that this is all leading to a cross moment and resurrection?
Yeah, so think about where the audiences of Mark and even the audience of Jesus in the story, they're all deeply embedded within a Roman culture, and they're in Jewish land, but it's occupied territory. So it's like all the people that are in Mark's audience and Jesus' audience, they're all people that that are politically angry. There's a lot of political anger because they've been kicked around for long enough, and they've been stepped on for long enough. And I mean, just imagine all the political angst and anger that we have up and running in our culture these days. I mean, it's nothing compared to what you would have found then. And the symbol of Roman oppression is the cross. So that whole culture would have seen crosses everywhere. They were meant as billboards. They were meant to be on the highways and byways so that you saw, if you sort of agitate against Rome, this is what awaits you. And Jesus is saying, get on one of those. And that's my destiny. So his initial gospel preaching is the gospel of the kingdom. And the way that his disciples are hearing that is, we're going to Jerusalem to slaughter Romans and get them off of the land and take our country back. That's what this is all about. And so for Jesus to say, no, we're going to the capital to lose, would be seriously deflating, which is why Peter tries to talk him out of it and rebukes him. And Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Like, the message of cultural victory is a satanic message. It's not just sort of off, it's satanic, according to Jesus.
Talk more about that.
Yeah, it's so it's like, just realize this: if you were taught, I mean, like I was, that we need to, get our country back for God and become a country that honors God again and all of that sort of thing. And this is what I was raised according to, and I would have totally bought it. Just if you very strongly associate that form of teaching with what is in the Bible and what's Christian, just realize that you've been sold something that is profoundly evil. And if you think, well, how can that be? I've listened to XYZ figure for most of my adult life and going to church my whole life, read the Bible my whole life. Whatever Bible knowledge and whatever that you have is pathetic compared to a first century Jew whose Bible was their story, was their history, and everything. And all those people had so much memorized. The Bible was all they talked about. They lived on the land marked out by the Bible. And they thought that God wanted to violently take back their land and get pagan people off their land and have cultural triumph. So it's like, we're in the same boat. If they had no hope against that kind of message, like, don't imagine that you're so biblically savvy that you would get it. Seriously, I think about that every morning. Every morning. I will never know my Bible the way Nicodemus knew his Bible. And Jesus met him and said, you have to start over. You don't know anything. So, That's me. If you want to put your knowledge of Greek up against mine, I'm totally fine with that. You might know it better. But so for Bible experts, Jesus is telling them you've got to completely start over. And the thing that the disciples and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests, everybody in the gospel wants the Romans gone and wants Jesus to be a figure who achieves military victory and brings in the kingdom of God. And Jesus says, I'm not doing that. I'm here to lose. I'm here to give my life. And I'm starting a radically different political movement. And its central symbol is the symbol of loss and the symbol of imperial power. That's a threat. This is very threatening. For me, this has been about a 20-year project of thinking back to where did we go wrong? Was it in the late 60s, or where did we go wrong? And it's we went wrong as soon as we got here, as soon as white Europeans got here and said, we're building a thing here, we're slaughtering brown people, we're going to enslave African people and bring them here to build a great thing for God. It basically started wrong. So it's in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and just messed up this thing. So it's we have work to do, and it's good work. It's called repentance, confession of sin, restoration, reconciliation. These are all Bible things. So it's not unfortunate. It's this is wonderful, but I think we've kind of missed how it is that America and all its promise and wonder has hijacked our gospel and given us something that is apparently shiny, but is hollow on the inside. And so we can do a lot of listening in silence and praying for God to open our eyes, and then doing the work to discern.
That's good. Okay, Drew. So can I ask a follow-up question on that? How do you think, or what do you think the church's role on a very specific action-orientated basis to undermine that movement that the church is so deeply ingrained politically, things like that? How do we try to unwind that, basically?
Yeah. I think it's a great project for us to do the work of learning. Because I have found for myself, Moses and I were talking about this morning, I'm 50 years old, and I was educated, in the 70s and 80s in grade school. It's I'm realizing the story of America that I heard is just about a quarter of the story, and it's from just the wrong perspective. So for me currently, it means a lot of reading, a lot of learning. And in our church this spring, we discussed Dante Stewart's book, Shouting in the Fire, which I just encourage you all to read. Everyone should read that book. He's a Christian writer, genius writer, wrote a memoir of growing up in the Black American church in South Carolina, going to college on a full scholarship to Clemson, and falling in love with white Christianity and wanting as a black man to be embraced by white Christians, and then his reversal of seeing that what he had inherited, the kind of Christianity he had inherited, was worthy of being loved. It's just a very interesting story of how whiteness lands on all of us, how it reshapes our imagination. And we then read a book called The Church Cracked Open and discussed that. I think some of those kind of projects would be great. I think that this is what disciples have to do as groups of us, to learn how to tear down the idols that we've all inherited. None of us was born wanting to construct these idolatrous conceptions. We just inherited them from people who loved us, which is makes it more complicated. So I think we have to just learn what happened to us. Where are we? So that we can see where our repentance lies. What does it mean to be Christian? And the gospel call in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke is repent, for the kingdom of God is here. So if we're going to turn toward the kingdom, where are we when we're turning? How have we been shaped? And I think education is a big part of that. Keep in mind, I would just say this too. When we do that work of education and learning and doing our part to open our eyes, it's important that we all do it as Christian people, because Christian people are claimed by God. Jesus, what's interesting in Mark is Mark never stops calling Jesus' disciples his disciples, even though they keep failing. They're his disciples, and he calls them my disciples. I say that because too often in church spaces, which are sometimes white spaces, we learn about all these realities as white people, and which generates guilt and shame and defensiveness and all that. But if we're Christian people who are already claimed by God and loved by God, we're liberated to learn. There's nothing at stake. We're already loved. So we can learn and we can turn.
Okay, so I really appreciate the challenge in Mark that feels so different from how I was raised in 80s Christian culture. During your intro, you talked about just the juxtaposition of kind of that rhetoric of asking Jesus into your heart versus Jesus being king and his kingdom. And I'm curious, where did that line of thinking come from that I was taught to ask Jesus into my heart? And how would you encourage us as parents of young children to replace that phrase?
Oh, that's a
that
great question.
line of thinking.
Yeah. So that way of thinking actually comes from just a long tradition, like hundreds of years, at least 500 years of thinking and a larger Western view of things where we have focused on the individual, and then where we have Christianity being largely a matter of internal to here. So, and that is necessary, by the way. It's necessary, especially on American soil, when the ones who developed Christian thinking and Christian conceptions of things have already decided, for the purpose of gaining wealth, to slaughter their neighbor and enslave their neighbor. You cannot have a way of being Christian that is centered around loving your neighbor if you've already decided to kill them. So you take this Christian conception of things and you make it internal. It's about my heart. It's not about how I act out here. Don't judge me. Get your legalism off of me. It doesn't matter what I do. It matters what's in here. My motive. This is about the motive. Don't judge me. So it's internal and it's eternal. It has to do with my future. It doesn't have to do with my behavior here. So the kind of Christianity that we all inherited was a Christianity necessary to be excused from basic life-giving duties of neighbor love. So it's really insidious, actually. But I think we can use a different language. We did this with our kids when they were young. We talked about Jesus being Lord over our home, and that He gives us life as we share life with one another, as we reconcile, as we learn to speak life-giving words to one another. And so He wasn't necessarily in our hearts. He was filling the space of our home. The Spirit filled our home. And here's how that can be awesome for us: when we forgive, or when we say, please forgive me, or I hurt you, or I took that without asking. Those are the words that we can use that make this a life-giving experience. So anything to get us all situated into a larger reality and have our kids see that kind of thing, I think is helpful.
That's great. Okay, we have time for one more question in the back here.
I wasn't raised evangelical, so I find Mark very refreshing to me in how I think about faith. I just wonder, historically, did Christianity ever really get it right? Or did the church ever really get it right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've wondered that myself. I don't know. Truly, at least in my context, I can't say that it has, according to what we're seeing on the pages of the New Testament. But I tend to think that I'm looking in the wrong places. So where would I look? I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is the best part of Michigan, really. Michigan is the worst economy in the country. But in the pocket where I live, it's a great place. In Grand Rapids, I don't know if you know anything about Grand Rapids, it's Jerusalem. It's got a huge Christian heritage, and everybody thinks they're Christian there. And the DeVosses all live there, and they fund everything, and they're huge churches. According to Mark, where would I look if I wanted to find a church? I'd want to look at some community that's not the dominant culture. So probably also there's a massive migrant farming community because all the farms in West Michigan. And there are a lot of communities of undocumented people that have learned and know how to stay in the shadows and are unseen. If I were going to look for a Christian community anywhere in my town, I would know where to look. It would be in those spaces and places. People whose lives are hard, people who are illegal, people who can be easily kicked around. There are some, Breonna Taylor was from Grand Rapids. There was somebody recently shot in Grand Rapids, a black man recently shot. A film came out recently on that. I would expect to find Christian communities in historic black communities in Grand Rapids. And I would expect to find Christian communities in historically white communities that are doing the creative work of looking to see how they could be part of the developing homelessness problem that we have. We just hit the jackpot. Our house, tripled in value, and real estate's it's out of control in my town, which is great news for me, and terrible news for all the people being displaced. So our church is part of a group of churches that are trying to figure out solutions for that. So I feel confident that those things are Christian. Where there's power, prestige, and privilege, I think we should not expect to see Jesus anywhere around there. If I could step outside of Mark for a second, keep in mind that in the churches, when Jesus talks to the churches in Revelation, he threatens them that if they're comfortable, I'm gonna leave. So I think we should expect, if we've read Revelation 2 and 3, we should expect to see Christian communities all over our country where Jesus has no idea what is going on there. He's just nowhere to be found, which is kind of scary. Also, by the way, just back to what Brenda mentioned earlier, in the Bible, the whole of the Bible, the question is never raised, what about those people who have never heard? Never once. The question comes up in nearly every biblical document. What about those people who have heard and who know and who aren't doing?
Woo. Well, that's a good way to wrap up. Kind of like Mark does, right? Tim, thanks so much for bringing.
Yeah, thanks for
I
having me.
appreciate when we are in these exploration spaces. Yeah, let's give him a hand.
Yeah.
We're in this exploration space. This is our Exploration Sunday. We kick off the beginning of exploration here. This is a place of humility. This is a place of curiosity. This is a posture that we bring where we're not trying to get the Q&A, it's a Q&R. So it's stepping into the next month of exploration of the book of Mark and all of what Mark is trying to show us through that gospel. And so thanks for kicking it off with us.
Thank you.
And by the way, there were a couple books you mentioned. We'll capture those, and we're creating a library for Redemption, and Alana's helping to kind of catalog everything for us and putting that together. So we'll include those books in the library. We're going to have this awesome checking like a traditional library with real tangible books. It's amazing, yeah. So that's getting in form at the HQ. And we've got a lot of resources there. We'll also have resources on the website available to you if you want to do more exploration of the book of Mark. We've got a Mark commentary written by Gombis himself that's going to be in that library at the HQ. So a lot of further, yeah, you got another sale. A lot of further exploration. Just one. That's right. Yeah, just. But I would love if you would offer a benediction over us, a blessing for us to embody what we've been talking about today, to step into further exploration and to be formed so that we can live for the sake of our communities, because that's who we are as a redemption community. That's who we strive to be, and we approach that from this place of humility and curiosity and learning. And so would you just help us to step into that for this month?
Life is short, my friends, and there's too little time for us to comfort the hearts of those who travel the way with us. So let us be swift to love. Let us be quick to be kind. And may the blessing of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit remain with us and go with us and regather us again. Amen.
Have a great week. We'll see you back here next week.